Okay, it is exactly noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. I would like to say hello. My name is Tamara Jenkins. I'm the Communication and Engagement Manager for the Illinois Library Association. Again, before we get started, I'd just like to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted later this week on the ILA website. Also, we will leave questions about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of the presentation for questions. So please use the Q&A feature to post your questions and we'll answer them in the order that they came in. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce a member of the ILA Intellectual Freedom Committee, Mr. Edward Remus. Edward?
Thank you, Tamara, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Remus. I'm the Social Sciences Librarian at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, and as Tamara mentioned, a member of the ILA's Intellectual Freedom Committee. I'd like to begin by thanking Tamara, as well as Cynthia Robinson, for making today's event possible. This is the second of 3 new network webinars that our committee has organized this year. Our first event, featuring Timwell Black and organized by Suzanne Arist, explored how libraries can serve as sites of social justice, education, and advocacy. The recording of that event is now available on the ILA YouTube channel. Also, stay tuned for details on our third event, organized by Barbara Posinger, on the topic of fake news and the library's role in rebuilding trust in truth, and that event will feature James LaRue. The description of today's event reads as follows. For decades, librarians have faced intellectual freedom challenges in the form of individuals and organizations seeking to dictate the permissible bounds of library materials and library spaces on the grounds of family values or religious morality. While such challenges undoubtedly persist into the present, some more recent intellectual freedom challenges have arisen from those seeking to dictate the permissible bounds of library materials and library spaces on the grounds of social justice or anti-discrimination. These more recent challenges have arisen in the context of a global and national political realignment featuring diverse political forces, which variously describe themselves as populists, economic nationalists, and alt-rightists, up to and including some avowed white supremacists and fascists. Whether and how librarians' professional value of intellectual freedom should be applied in this context and to these various political forces remains a question of considerable importance. While the American Library Association has long placed intellectual freedom on the list of core values of librarianship, intellectual freedom exists on this list alongside other core professional values, including democracy, diversity, and social responsibility. During recent years, tensions between intellectual freedom and these other values have arisen in the context of 3 ALA documents: the 2017 Resolution on Libraries as Responsible Spaces, the 2 rounds of amendments, one in 2018 and one in 2019, to the ALA document Meeting Rooms, an Interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights, and most recently, the resolution to condemn white supremacy and fascism as antithetical to library work passed earlier this year. Since then, the Chicago Public Library has made national headlines by withdrawing 6 Dr. Seuss books from its circulating children's collection on the grounds that these books contain racist and insensitive imagery. The discussion and debate surrounding these documents and events reflects the struggles of librarians across the country to adjudicate our competing values and professional practice amidst the social and political climate described above. Joining us are 2 speakers who are uniquely qualified to address these issues. Emily Knox discusses how intellectual freedom can come into conflict with our competing professional values in her 2020 article, Intellectual Freedom and Social Justice, Tensions Between Core Values and Librarianship. Meanwhile, Nadine Strawson discusses how intellectual freedom can actually serve the ends of social justice in the long run in her 2018 book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Their speaker biographies, partially condensed, read as follows. Nadine Strawson, the John Marshall Harlan II Professor Emerita at New York Law School and the immediate past president of the American Civil Liberties Union, is a leading expert and frequent speaker and media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties who has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. She serves on the advisory boards of the ACLU, Electronic Privacy Information Center, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, Heterodox Academy, and the National Coalition Against Censorship. The National Law Journal has named her one of America's 100 most influential lawyers, and several other publications have named her one of the country's most influential women. Emily Knox is Interim Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and an Associate Professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her book, Book Banning in the 21st Century America is the first monograph in the Beta Phi Mu Scholars series. She also recently edited Trigger Warnings, History, Theory, Context, and co-edited Foundations of Information Ethics. Her articles have been published in the Library Quarterly, Library and Information Science Research, and the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy. Emily serves on the boards of the Beta Phi Mu and National Coalition Against Censorship. I've prepared a round of questions that I'll ask our speakers to address individually and together. These questions will move us from the deeper historical and philosophical foundations of intellectual freedom to more practical issues facing libraries in the areas of collection, spaces, and programming. This portion of today's event should last around 30 minutes. After that, we'll take questions from the audience, and I'll draw the event to a close at 1 p.m. Central. I won't be monitoring the chat for audience questions, but I will be using the Q&A feature. So if you have a question, please submit it via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. With that, please join me in a round of Zoom applause to welcome our speakers here today. And Nadine, my first question is to you. What historical and philosophical foundations would you offer to librarians who are trying to develop a perspective on intellectual freedom issues today?
Thank you so much. First, as a point of personal privilege, Ed, I want to take a moment to thank you, Emily, and all of the librarians who are here. You have always been my heroes. You are on the front lines of making our freedom to read and to learn and to question a reality and not just in theory. And this was very important to me as a kid growing up in a middle-class family that didn't really have books in the home. And I will have to say that the public library in my community did not support freedom to read for young people. I was confined to only 2 rooms of that library for my entire teenage years. It was later I discovered that the ALA's Bill of Rights, Library Bill of Rights in 1967 was amended to extend full access to the library to young people. That was a little bit too late for me, and I know that not every library adopted it. So I'm especially, from a personal perspective, really, really committed to the ALA Bill of Rights and the principles of not only liberty, but equality. It has to be meaningfully available for everybody. Also, the ACLU has worked very closely with the ALA on intellectual freedom issues, including in the landmark internet free speech case, which has gone down in history, named Reno, as in Janet Reno versus ACLU, but it was a consolidated case. And the other one was named after the ALA. And we worked very, very closely on that case. So the ACLU has continued to have the same vigorous discussions about our core intellectual freedom principles that I have been happy to follow with my colleagues in the ALA, because both of us, all of us, defend all fundamental freedoms for all people, the librarians specifically in the context of your vitally important work. But we continue to debate, even within the ACLU, especially within the ACLU. Should we continue to defend free speech, even for hate mongers? And I will refer to a very historic case from your very state of Illinois, the so-called Skokie case, which of course all of you in Illinois know that that's a town near Chicago, which you may not know at the time of the case in the late 1970s had not only a large Jewish population, but a very, very large population of Holocaust survivors. And although that was a slam dunk winner in the courts of law, because the courts defend this fundamental viewpoint neutrality principle, which is central to intellectual freedom as well, that we should not discriminate on the basis of, solely on the basis of disliking or disfavoring or even hating the viewpoint of the speaker. That was a slam dunk winner in the courts of law, but in the courts of public opinion, and even within the ACLU itself, it was very controversial. We lost 15% of our members who said, I defend free speech, but I'm going to draw the line. So I completely welcome the opportunity to continue what those of us who believe in intellectual freedom have a special responsibility to continue to debate and discuss and explore, right? So the philosophical and historical roots of intellectual freedom are essentially the same in the context of libraries as in the context of academic freedom and freedom of speech more generally. And that's why we face the same the same hard questions in all of these interrelated contexts. The ALA's Library Bill of Rights reflects broad general principles that have parallels in First Amendment law and in international human rights law, and also in the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, famous principles on academic freedom, which were agreed to in 1939, the same year the ALA first adopted its Library Bill of Rights. It was officially promulgated in 1940, but agreed upon in 1939 for the AAUP. And not coincidentally, all of these key developments that support intellectual freedom came to fruition at the same time in the late 1930s. That's also the same period when the Supreme Court issued its first majority opinions that strongly protected free speech. Before that, there had only been famous dissenting opinions from Justices Brandeis and Holmes, but we started to get pro-free speech majority opinions. And other developments also in that key year of 1939, not only the ALA Library Bill of Rights, but for the first time, the American Bar Association created a committee on the Bill of Rights. For the first time, the US Department of Justice created what was the forerunner of what is now called the Civil Rights Division, the first time that the Justice Department took an affirmative role in enforcing individual rights and liberties. And I think one of the explaining factors, because we were asked to comment about history, one of the explaining factors was a growing concern about fascism, both in the United States and overseas. The ALA Bill of Rights referred to this situation. It deplored intolerance and censorship as affecting the rights of minorities and individuals. And I thought that was interesting that it even talked about minorities before it talked about individuals. For both the ALA Bill of Rights and the other parallel principles, there's this core general notion that has a broad consensus. But from the beginning, there's been a lot of debate about how to implement that core concept in particular factual contexts. So the core concept, to which I've already alluded, is that all human beings have full and equal rights to freedom of speech, which includes freedom of access to information and ideas. And those rights may not be discriminatorily denied or limited based either on who the people are or what they believe. In all of these interrelated spheres of libraries, campuses, public free speech, other grounds for selection and exclusion are permissible, indeed essential. I mean, government couldn't literally allow all protests that people might want to stage at a particular park at the same time. So it therefore may and must enforce what we call content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. And government may also selectively suppress speech by particular individuals as long as the suppression is not solely due to disfavoring the speaker's identity or ideas, but rather because in context, the particular message poses a certain serious imminent harm. For example, harassment, which is very relevant in libraries, or to take one that's been in the news a lot lately, intentional incitement of imminent lawlessness or violence. Likewise, professors can't include all books on a topic on their syllabi, and libraries can't include all books on a topic in their physical collection. So in these contexts too, there are legitimate criteria for selection and exclusion, such as educational suitability and whether experts regard a book as authoritative. Again, though, the fundamental bottom line rule is the same. The decisions about selection and exclusion may not be based solely on disfavor toward particular speakers or ideas. Now, one final point, which is these ideas about the scope of intellectual freedom and academic freedom and free speech are all bound up with not only individual liberty and equality, as I've already alluded to, but also democracy. I mean, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, I never go anywhere without it, we the people wield sovereign power in our political system, and we can't possibly do that responsibly or effectively without full equal freedom both to convey and receive ideas. And the Supreme Court has said that speech about public affairs is more than a matter of individual self-expression. It is the essence of self-government. And of course, we were very far from the ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for all when our nation was founded, but we've been making progress. And essential engines of that progress have been public libraries, as well as public schools and public universities. And I believe that at the root of the effectiveness of these essential institutions, including libraries, has been their adherence to the core concept of viewpoint neutrality and neutrality on the basis of ideas and identity.
Thank you, Nadine. And Emily, I'll pose the same question to you. What historical and philosophical foundations would you offer to librarians who are trying to develop a perspective on intellectual freedom issues today?
So I think the easiest way for me to talk about it is to say a little bit about what I ask my students to do in my class, which is that I start actually with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, Article 19, to expand the scope outside of just the United States, to think about intellectual freedom as a human right, that it is not simply something that was discovered over time, but it's a part that it's something that's intrinsic to our autonomy and our development as individuals. So things that I'm thinking about a lot right now are issues of paternalism, in particular, when it comes to discussing intellectual freedom issues, discussions of harm, but also discussions of power. Who is making decisions? I often ask my students to interrogate that quite a bit. I have them read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, which is actually quite difficult because John Stuart Mill has racist statements within On Liberty. But I hope that my students, as they are developing in my course, are able to take not just his racist statements, but also think about what was he trying to convey when he was discussing these issues of truth and argument, and what does it mean to have a reasonable discussion with somebody. So I try to get my students to think about that. I think what's particularly compelling is that if you don't interrogate your position, no matter what your position is, that it's actually just an opinion. And Mill really tries to get people to think about, what does it mean to hold a particular position? How do you get someone to be on the side of your position? What I find a lot when I have these discussions about intellectual freedom and social justice is that people often imagine that they're talking to people who agree with them. And so this actually goes to my trigger warnings work, because people say, well, what if I put a trigger warning on this book? What if I put a label on this book? And I say things like, well, you know, some people actually don't know what a trigger warning is. They've never seen one before, and it doesn't have any meaning to them. And when you say, can I put a trigger warning on this book? What you're saying to me is a particularly interpretive community in which you reside. But a lot of people don't reside in that community. So when people say something like, well, you know, this thing was hateful, but who is making that interpretation, right? Is it our current Supreme Court justices who are making that interpretation that something is hateful? Would you agree with what their interpretation is about what is hateful and what is not? A lot of times what I find is people are looking for easy answers And what we see as we look through history is that there are not easy answers to questions about intellectual freedom. So I see that there are questions about withdrawing. I'm getting many more questions about labeling. Of course, this was part of the 1950s and labeling communist propaganda. These are just band-aids when actually the work of dismantling white supremacy, homophobia, racism, transphobia, classism, colonialism, this is hard work. It's actual engagement with ideas, often with ideas that are harmful, that are hateful, and convincing people that they are wrong. And you have to go through that work. And I've been thinking about this more and more as we go through this time after the protests last summer. And it's really engagement on a deep level. And it's not as easy as just simply removing information or saying that this information is bad in some way. So I hope that that gives a little bit of an overview of some of the things that I talk about in my courses to really provide a historical and philosophical foundation for thinking about these topics. And knowing that they are hard. It's not going to be easy and people will disagree with you.
Thank you, Emily. And one common thread I hear in both of you is, I suppose the way I think about it is that the principle of liberty should really guide the state and state-supported institutions like libraries and the professionals who work within them, that when it comes to the possibility that is open to libraries and other state-supported institutions to conduct censorship of viewpoints or materials, that it should really be the principle of liberty and not democracy that determines this. And I think this does come into conflict with certain values or beliefs that I think professionals often have. And so it is, I see this very much as an argument worth sort of spelling out. At this point, I would invite each of you to just comment a little bit on each other's perspectives, any points of convergence or divergence, and maybe on this question also of liberty versus democracy as a principle guiding these issues.
I'd love to weigh in on that, Ed. I won't speak for Emily, but the way I processed what she said it does square with my view, which is that this is not an either or situation. It is a both and. In my experience, and I try as hard as humanly possible to be open-minded, I could not agree more strongly with Emily and with John Stuart Mill that this is what we have to do. I remember one of my favorite quotes comes from a judge named Learned Hand who said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right. So I'm always looking for counter evidence and counter arguments. But so far, I continue to be convinced through looking at evidence and experience, not only here, but also around the world. I agree with Emily, these are principles of international human rights, not solely American law. That we cannot have meaningful equality or democracy without liberty. And I could say the same thing. We cannot have meaningful liberty without equality and democracy. They are all inextricably interrelated. And I think it's really important to make that case to people. I mean, these are important principles, but I think that this is a case that can be made purely on pragmatic, strategic grounds. If you really do want to strengthen our democracy and the equal participation of everybody in this democracy, censorship is absolutely the wrong way to go. And for all of its imperfections, the least bad strategy is robust free speech.
Yeah, I actually would refer to some of the things that we see happening in the States right now with the voter suppression laws that we see happening. It might seem at first that, well, how does this relate to issues of liberty? But in fact, what those suppression laws are doing is saying that these people don't agree with my position. I am going to take away their ease of access to the franchise because I don't agree with what their outcome will be. And you can see how this issue of liberty and justice, democracy kind of get interwoven very quickly, because it's the idea, because what you could actually see it from the other point of view. What if people from, let's say, the left were saying, I don't want these people who disagree with me to have their ideas circulating in the public sphere, right? It's a lot of times these are looked at from points of view of like left, right, but actually they're picture issues of power and the circulation of ideas. I don't really like the idea of marketplace. It's not really a marketplace. It's really about people fighting back and forth saying, I say I have this position, you have this other position. I'm going to use my position of authority to make it so that your position is not heard the way that my position is heard. And you can see how these become very intertwined quickly. And that's why I always worry when people say things like, this book should be removed, right? Because it's using power. It's using your power as a librarian, right? Or whoever you might be to say, this should be moved out of the public sphere. And it happens to be that you have that power, but when you take that kind of power, you're also giving it to someone who might disagree with you, right? You're saying that I feel this way, but what if someone on the other side also doesn't feel that way? And they want to use their own power to remove these ideas from the public sphere. I was in a very interesting committee meeting for FIFE, which is the Intellectual Freedom Committee for the International Federation for Library Associations. And someone from the Global South talked about the worry that people within his country have about the fact that President Trump was removed from Twitter. Now, from my point of view, like, that was fine. I didn't have a problem with it. But from this person's point of view, what does it mean that the most powerful person in the world could be removed from this platform? What does it mean for dissidents within his own country that Twitter had this much power over the most powerful person in the world? Is it in fact true that Jack Dorsey is actually the most powerful person in the world, not the President of the United States? I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about all of these knock-on effects of removing President Trump because it wasn't a problem for me. Like, quite honestly, Twitter is a private platform. You know, Jack Dorsey can do what he wants. But as we think more broadly about the power dynamics that were involved in that, and what do they say for people who are, for example, trying to resist authoritarian governments within their own countries? How are people thinking about that? And that is really where issues of liberty, democracy, freedom of expression, all get smushed up together. And you have to hear other people's points of view. That's what I was doing, right? This was someone who I had my own truth, but they pushed against this truth. And I have to think more clearly about my own position with regard to Twitter and the President of the United States.
And Alexei Navalny made exactly that same point right away, as did Angela Merkel and a couple other leaders of democracies. They were very concerned. And Emily, to your point of thinking of who has power, even within this country, there are so many communities where the powerful perspective is still what Ed referred to as, traditional, conventional conservatives. I was really, and so-called traditional family values as reasons for pressure to remove library books. I just looked at the ALA's list of the 20 most banned books last year, and it was astounding. I think 7 of them were about LGBTQ and racial justice, right, including the hate you give, and there were only a couple that were attacked from a more progressive perspective.
Yes, and this continues to be true. And when I'm teaching, I always tell my students that, in fact, intellectual freedom is what leads to social justice, because it is what allows people to have the right to resist, to stand up to ideas that are unjust. And without intellectual freedom, you cannot do that. And it's not that it's always easy, or that someone won't sue you, or that you won't go to jail, right? That's not really how resistance works. But you do have that right as a human being to say, no, I think this is wrong. I have these other ideas that are also worthy of contemplation.
Thank you both. I'd like to move on now to consider how this applies to the area of library collections. And I'd like to integrate a question we've received from an audience member, which I think speaks to some of the recent issues very directly. The audience member writes, I work at a youth service department in a public library. Staff in my library has used intellectual freedom as a way to defend racist books and keep them in our collection. We follow Crew's guidelines, which state that we can weed based on racist or sexist material. How do you approach this to weed materials that no longer fit the community needs? I am interested in finding out better how to better help our changing community. Thank you.
Emily is the library expert here. If I can start by saying what the First Amendment parameters are, because of course the public library is bound by First Amendment principles, and the one Supreme Court decision in this whole area is quite analogous to the question, because it had to do with removal of certain books from school libraries. I understand this is a public library, but for the Youth Services Division, so it's fairly analogous. It was a case that was handled by the ACLU in New York called Pico versus Island Trees School District, and at that time we had a very conservative organization that was challenging books that were written by Black authors and were advocating for racial justice were a big part of the list, but the same principles would apply. And basically the Supreme Court said that of course librarians have to have an enormous amount of expert discretion that should not be interfered with by courts to make determinations about factors such as educational suitability. However, the limits on that discretion are the following: that books may not be removed solely to suppress ideas that are disfavored on narrowly partisan grounds. And now I add that because that seems to me different from saying ideas that are disfavored because they are expressing racially discriminatory views. The specific example that the Supreme Court gave of a narrowly partisan purpose for removing books was, for example, if all books by, let's say, Democrats are in control of the school board. In that case, it was Republicans are in control of the school board, and assuming they remove all books by Democratic authors, that would be unconstitutional. So I think this, to me, presents as a constitutional law matter. I think there would be a strong argument that there are reasons of educational suitability. I need to know the exact books, but I would also say, picking up on a point that Emily was making, that I would have very strong, even if I could do it constitutionally. Now I shouldn't venture into the librarian's role, but if I were, as a professor, say, we're deciding, should I expose my students to John Stuart Mill, despite the fact that some of the things that he says are racist? Should I expose my students to what I think is one of the most greatest works ever, Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, despite the fact that he uses the N-word several times, and therefore certain professors have been attacked for teaching it. And I would say that there is still, the devil's in the details as to particular works, but the fact that it uses racist language or advocates racist ideas, well, let me give an example that pertains to what some people consider a race that I belong to, namely Jews, specifically the book Mein Kampf. Written by Hitler to, decry the race of Jews as is not human and subject to extermination from his perspective. I strongly support the availability of that book precisely so that people can engage with the ideas. One other point, going back to legal, because I realize I've ventured beyond that. From a legal perspective, I think it's also really important to have policies in place and policies and procedures that could then govern these decisions, and presumably they would lay out criteria rather than doing it on an ad hoc basis.
Yeah, so I always add policy into my courses to make sure you have written policy. I see you're using Crew for this. But I would actually also encourage you to think about Aschheim's Selection, Not Censorship. So this is the classic work from 1953, which is thinking about, am I trying to come up with a reason to get rid of a book, right? As opposed for a reason to keep a book. Aschheim's essay is freely available online. If you look it up, you can find it. But I would also think a bit more in a nuanced way about what do you mean by, let me talk about two things, about the issue of racist, right? What do you mean by a racist book? Sometimes that is clear, but sometimes that is unclear. Are we talking about Little House on the Prairie? That's a racist book. That's a colonialist book. All books about Western expansion are all colonialist by definition. Are you thinking about getting rid of all of those books? One of my favorite authors is Agatha Christie. All of her books are anti-Semitic. It's really easy to find that in there. Are you getting rid of Agatha Christie's books? I also love Sherlock Holmes. He has this truly horrific short story about a child from West Africa who shows up in one of the mystery stories. I had forgotten about it until I was listening to it on audiobook. And I was like, oh, I forgot how racist Arthur Conan Doyle was, right? Are you planning on getting rid of Sherlock Holmes in your library? What I'm saying is that once you start thinking about what do we mean by these terms, in fact, you're looking at much more within your collection overall, which is why you need to have good policies that are written out and thinking very clearly about your own community. I will also say that I always encourage libraries to not think about balance, but representation within their collections. This is actually from Jenna Friedman, who's the reference librarian at Barnard College. I almost always talk about what she had to say because I think a lot of librarians worry about, if I have this thing on this side, I need to have that thing on that side. That's not really how your collection should work. It should be representative. And some of that representation will be distasteful and upsetting to you personally. But that's not really the point of a library collection, for everything to be something that works with your own ideas of how the world should work. Because in fact, you don't know why someone is reading a book and what they will get out of reading a particular book. So I said I read Agatha Christie. Clearly I love mysteries, right? But when I read Agatha Christie, I'm not like, oh, this is a great idea that she has to say about Jewish people in post-war and interwar England, right? What it actually says to me is, this is fascinating to see. In fact, the milieu in which Agatha Christie worked and lived, and how insidious anti-Semitism was within England in this time. it's my own interpretation of thinking about these ideas that are not even part of these books, right? The book is about the mystery in like some old house. It just comes up in people's talk, and it says something about the society and also helps me understand something about history. So I would think very carefully when you are reading books for any reason. I understand that this is more difficult for children's books, that in fact there was a great purge of children's books in the 70s and 80s. And we're going through something similar right now, thinking about what sort of culture and ideas do we want to give to children. All, you know, when we think about like what is the best picture books for children. But I would say it's still best to think about representation and not balance. Buy more books by diverse authors. That's really, to me, the answer to having a well-representative collection within your library. This is difficult, of course, because the entire publishing industry is actually built on white supremacy, colonialism, all of these issues. So you need to support the authors, put forward ideas that you think are reflective of your community. I don't necessarily think that means that you need to remove all of these books that are not reflective of where our society is today. Because honestly, if you start doing that, a lot of your collection will just be gone.
You know, it's interesting, Emily, because I'm thinking of a book that I've been trying to get a hold of and I can't. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it's been gotten a lot of publicity because it's a big handbook for the alt-right and white supremacists. And a lot of them, you may know the book I'm talking about. A lot of them had it when they were marching on, you know, in the insurrection on January 6th. And I really still want to read it, not because I'm going to become a convert to their cause, but I want to try to figure out what they see in it and what motivates them.
Is this the Turner Diaries?
Turner Diaries. I knew it had the word
Yes.
Turner in it. I thought, no, Nat Turner. No, that's a good book. I can get that one. Thank you for reminding me. You know, Emily, that philosophy about collection, I think that is brilliant. And I have never seen anything like that posted in any public library. And I've frequented many public libraries. I think that would be so helpful. So readers understand, or patrons of the library understand that they should see every book, that they might think, why is this book here? But if they understand the collection philosophy, I think that would have a wonderfully educational and promoting of intellectual freedom impact on the users.
Yeah, I agree. And I really encourage librarians to make their collection development policies available and know how to respond when somebody is upset about something on your shelf. That's one of the things I teach in my course.
You know, each of your comments bring to mind just a short anecdote. When I was studying to be a librarian in 2010, working at a public library, I was partially mentored by someone who was then retiring, and she described how she had had an experience decades before of many veterans of the Second World War actually coming to the library to request Mein Kampf because they wanted their children to understand the ideology that they had fought against in the war. And I think that's a sensibility that we don't always consider or think about, but I think it speaks very much to what each of you has said. And I'd like to move on, and maybe we can address these sort of together. They're sort of related but distinct. These two other issues that come up, namely spaces and programming. And so library meeting room use has been a controversial issue in recent years, and that concerns more someone outside the library coming in to use a space. And then, of course, the issue of programming refers to the library actually determining what the positive programming of the library will be. And I think especially as libraries try or approach the possibility of addressing social political conflict, the controversies of the recent years, this often raises some intellectual freedom questions. So I guess I'd open the floor to those two issues, spaces and programming. How do you think intellectual freedom issues or principles could be applied?
If I could start with just the legal parameters, which again give a lot of room for policy options on the part of libraries, but you should know what those boundaries are. And those boundaries are reflected in the materials that the ALA has put out. So presumably folks are quite familiar with them. First of all, the public library is a government institution, therefore subject to basic First Amendment doctrines, including about public property, government-owned property. And here the Supreme Court has used the term forum. It has said that government property that is not a traditional public forum, traditionally open to speech, such as parks and sidewalks, but rather is a building, including a library building, government has no obligation to open it to the public for purposes of meetings. However, the library could choose to do what many do, to create what's called a designated public forum, to designate meeting space in the library at particular times as open to the public for purposes of speech and meeting activities. Once the library goes in that direction and chooses to create a designated public forum, it may not discriminate on the basis of ideas or affiliations as to who can use that forum. And the Library Bill of Rights reflects that concept, and that also goes back to the very first version in 1939. Interestingly, I noticed that the ALA talks about making the space available on an equitable basis. In terms of law, it has to be an equal basis. You can't discriminate based on ideas. You certainly could, say that if people who behaved in certain ways would be off limits regardless of what their ideas were. So you can have behavioral regulations, but not limitations based on hatred of the ideas or even hateful ideas, as you well know. And I think, of course, the library, I think, is especially important, puts up disclaimer signs and makes clear to the public that this is no means an endorsement of anything other than intellectual freedom. When it comes to the library's own programming, though, we move from the concept of a public forum or a designated public forum to government speech. The library is itself exercising its own free speech right, which it can choose to propound any message that it wants to, and not any other message that it doesn't want to. So it could affirmatively, proactively program, for example, Black Lives Matter related books in February and women's history books in March. And it wouldn't therefore have to have materials about poets in April, right? To take an example, but it could choose for whatever reasons it wanted to.
Yes, I would say that what really people are thinking about when this discussion of programming and spaces comes up is, for example, inviting TERFs to come speak at the library. But I often think that that is not really where most libraries are operating. So what I think about are the small towns here in Illinois. Often, some of them are former sundown towns. They are often 98% white. What if this local students want to have a Black Lives Matter meeting at the library? What sort of protests would they encounter with that? By having the library being equal, the space equal to all, the local public library and some of the small towns around me would host those programs. And I think that is actually the most important, because of course there are many people who think that Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, is a hate group. Our former president said he was upset about DC putting Black Lives Matter outside on one of the streets because he said Black Lives Matter is a hate group. It's actually the way, and this is common, that in fact, this idea of hate groups, hate speech is often used against people whose voices are marginalized. It's not usually used for people whose voices are not marginalized. I also think that this is the time when somebody who is harmful or distasteful is using the space. This is the time for counter speech that happened here at the Urbana Free Library. There was a TERF panel. There was a lovely carnival outside of the library. I don't even know how many people actually went to that panel. I mean, that's one thing to do, is just not go, not listen to what people have to say. You do not have to show up. But there was also a trans affirming carnival get together outside of the Urbana Free Library to show people that in fact, most people thought that the people on that panel were wrong, that their ideas were wrong. I don't think that libraries should actually try to manipulate their policies to say who can and cannot use their spaces. You can have a behavioral policy. This is one of the recommended policies from the ILA, but in fact, I worry that especially authorities of various types would manipulate libraries' policies to make sure that marginalized voices are not heard within the library. That is actually how a lot of this works out. So the example I use a lot is I ask my students, okay, so you want to talk about labeling something, what kind of music is labeled as explicit? And eventually the students get around to, oh, rap and hip hop. I'm like, that is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that that is the music that is labeled, because in fact, people who have been through trauma of various sorts, collective trauma, a lot of times their music will be explicit and it will get this label. That's just the way, in fact, structures work. So I am always hesitant for libraries to start engaging in thinking about who is worthy of using the library and who is not.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about small towns in Illinois, Emily, because I mentioned the Skokie case, and in the ACLU's brief in that case, we pointed out that the very same complaints that were being made by the Holocaust survivors, toward whom I and we certainly had great sympathy, but that this speech was dangerous, that it was upsetting, that it was traumatic, that it was unpatriotic. We pointed out that those very same arguments were made against the Martin Luther King movement in Cicero, Illinois, just a few years earlier, and we successfully defeated those arguments to keep out the pro-civil rights demonstrators.
So I'd like to offer you each a few minutes for just some closing remarks. And I think it might be useful in this final portion of our event to address a really big picture question that's been raised here in the Q&A. An attendee asks, what if what people believe is a verifiable lie, as with former President Trump and the media that repeated their lies? Why should we protect speech that destroys the democracy and trashes the US Constitution that are the basis of our government? And I just want to add to that a kind of similar question. I mentioned this event to a librarian colleague who I know considers himself a progressive, and I mentioned these topics of free speech and intellectual freedom, and his comment on the issue was that if you give fascists free speech, they will use it to take away the right of you and others to have free speech. And so I think this question from the audience member, and as well as that anecdote, sort of get at the same issue. So I'm wondering in closing, how would each of you respond? And do you see a role of defending free speech in the face of these objections?
Well, I'm happy to go first. I believe that speech can do great harm, as the Supreme Court said in a recent case where it upheld the right to engage in very controversial speech. We protect it not because we deny the power of speech to be harmful, hateful, dangerous, but precisely because of its great power, which can do great good as well as great harm. The fact that speech can be harmful is not a justification for suppressing it. You also have to ask 2, 3 other follow-up questions logically before you could support censorship. Number one would be, will the censorship effectively repress the idea or even the expression? Or in fact, as has been true throughout history, will it simply have, if anything, an amplifying impact by drawing additional attention to and even sympathy for the speech that it otherwise would not have had? Donald Trump's ideas certainly have not gone away by virtue of his being thrown off Twitter. If anything, his supporters have become even more committed to their entrenched ideas. The second logical question you have to ask is there any negative, unintended adverse consequence of the censorial regime? And here I want to underscore a point that Emily has also made repeatedly, and this is based on interviewing and reading human rights activists from around the world. They say consistently, disproportionately, any censorship, whether it's of hate speech, whether it's of disinformation, whether it's of extremist or terrorist speech, is always disproportionately used against those who lack power, the very people that you're seeking to empower. And that's not a coincidence. That follows logically from the fact that these are very subjective concepts, and therefore how they're enforced depends on who wields power, as Emily said. And so by definition, minority groups, whether it's political minorities or racial or ethnic minorities, are going to be the ones that are going to suffer. I mean, one person's disinformation is somebody else's sacred truth. And then the third question you have to ask is, are there other measures that we can take that would be even more effective in pursuing the goals of liberty, equality, democracy, diversity, inclusivity, all of the wonderful goals that we're all supportive of? And here I heard Emily echoing what the Supreme Court described as counter speech, education, more information rather than less. Ultimately, censorship is very superficial. Emily referred to it as a Band-Aid. You are just suppressing particular superficial manifestations of deep-seated attitudes. And we want to get at the underlying attitudes. And we also certainly want to punish any actual discriminatory or violent conduct. That's much more effective than censorship.
Yeah, I would say to your friend that giving fascist free speech does not make them more powerful. Giving fascists power, it makes them more powerful. As Nadine said, I just worry that these are easy answers, right? And there actually are not an easy answer to something like misinformation on the internet, because that's often in the eye of the beholder and has to do with people's own worldviews and other contexts, things going on in their life, the way that they were raised, their religious beliefs. A lot of these things are not as simple as saying, this is a lie. I wish it was, because I often agree that it's a lie, but telling somebody that something is a lie doesn't really matter unless we can get to why do they feel the need to actually perpetuate this lie? Why are people so susceptible, particularly in our country, to something like QAnon, right? What is going on actually in these various movements? Just saying that it's wrong, it's a lie, it's misinformation, that doesn't actually change those people's commitments. I mean, if you talk to people who have, been removed from, for example, cults, it's actually not just telling people that something is untrue over and over again that actually keeps them, moves them away from there. I worry that that people will use these, as Nadine calls censorious, I call them censorship practices, but censorship as an easy way of saying, okay, now this is gone, but it's not gone. We still are grappling with the events of January 6th. It's much deeper than just that event. What happened before? What happened after? How do we respond? What do we do with those people? What if those people are in our family, right? I mean, that's the actual work. I keep saying that this is work. It's not actually something that can be done easily. We have to go through the work.
And the work is something that libraries are so well equipped to do, which is critical media skills, right? Critical reading and literacy and how to do research and evaluation.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank each of you for your participation in today's event. I'm very thrilled with this discussion. I'm grateful for our audience participation and for those who made this event possible. So once again, please join me in a round of Zoom applause for Nadine and Emily. We very much appreciate you being with us here today.
Thanks to everybody, including you, Ed, and the audience.
Yes, thank you so much.
And a recording will be available. Okay, take care.
Take care. Thank you.